So thank you to our colleagues from the Namibia Media Professionals Union for that moving and important tribute, and we wish that we could have been there to mark this occasion with you in person. Sorry, we had a slight technical interruption there. This next session follows on directly from that poignant moment and provides an opportunity for us to commemorate all those who have died from COVID-19. Let me put this in some perspective. More than 1,200 journalists have died globally from COVID-19. In India, one journalist died every day in April 2021. In Peru, more than 140 have died. In Colombia, 80. In Italy, Bangladesh, and the US. Sorry, I'm getting technical feedback here. These deaths are not just statistics. They are humans, colleagues, friends, and family members, and we mourn each and every loss. People like Frank Bedoya in Colombia, Damodar Adhikari in Nepal, Ram Prakash Gupta in India, Jose Luis Garcia Tapia in Mexico, and Mohammed Munir, who died after contracting COVID in jail after having been arrested accused of spreading fake news. Journalism is not a crime, and we reiterate today our call for all journalists unjustly imprisoned for their work to be freed. And we reiterate that fake news laws which criminalise independent journalism must be repealed. And we at the IFJ mourn the loss too of 3 of our union leaders here in Africa, giants of the fight for rights and freedoms, Stanis Nkunje and Kasonga Shilunde from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Foster Dongozi, our brother from Zimbabwe. So it's not enough just to remember. It's also about making sure that journalism can operate in an environment where the health and safety of the journalist is protected and a priority for media, and that employers with a duty of care do not put profits before lives, where health and safety laws are enforced to protect lives. That's why remember the dead and fight for the living. And at the forefront of that demand have been unions and associations of journalists. In this session, we will hear from journalist unions representatives from around the world about the work that they have done to protect the health of journalists, provide support to the families of those affected, to demand the release of those jailed, to campaign for financial support so journalists are not forced to work when ill, and to supply protective equipment and develop the policies, the protocols, and the agreements that can help make our workplaces COVID safe. First, we will hear from Somalia and Montenegro, then from Brazil and Pakistan. We'll show some brief video clips from Palestine, from Yemen, Peru, Cambodia, and El Salvador. And finally, we will hear from our colleagues at the International Labour Organization about the international standards, which mean this is not just an issue where we have to rely on the benevolence of media employers or governments, but that we all have the right to a safe and healthy working environment. So with those opening remarks, let me turn to our first 2 panelists. So Omar Farooq Osman, the General Secretary of the National Union of Somali Journalists, and Boyana sorry, the wrong picture came up there. Boyana Konata, who is an award-winning journalism graduate and responsible for research and coordination of projects for the Trade Union of Media of Montenegro. So let me turn first to you, Omar. How has the COVID pandemic impacted on journalists and journalism in Somalia?
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thank you to colleagues who are joining us in this panel, and as well as this important discussion is. COVID has really seriously impacted, journalism and journalists in Somalia in a number of ways. First of all, loss of employment, income loss, where the immediate impact is of the pandemic on Somali journalists. COVID made an already bad situation worse. Journalists were already working under poor conditions, and the pandemic exposed the challenges we face in terms of poor pay, lack of social protection in employment contracts, and larger numbers of journalists working without any written contracts. Many media organizations laid off workers or cut pay and even reduced working hours. Our first reaction was to engage media employers to make sure that they meet their contractual obligations when laying off workers, or at least they respect the labor laws of the country, as well as following the international standards as stated by the International Labour Organization. And I'm happy that we are being joined by a colleague from the ILO. Our main concern for both those who remained working and those who were laid off was the safety. So we shared information on personal protective measures that they could use to avoid catching or being infected by COVID, whether at home or at work or in the field. Very recently, for us, what we have also produced is a manual to guide, journalists how to remain safe, how to protect themselves, and how to make sure that they remain a professional during COVID. And that's the work that we have done with the UN Agency on Migration.
And tell me about the kind of difference that has been made with, say, the priority vaccination campaign that you ran.
Yes. Well, what we have done is, first of all, we fought that and campaigned very aggressively, April last year, for journalists to be designated as essential workers. We have campaigned for that. Luckily, the government has designated journalists as essential workers or frontline workers. And then this year, when the vaccine has arrived, journalists, we also again appealed to the government that journalists to be included in the categories that will be given a priority in terms of vaccination. And they have been included, and journalists have been taking, we have been recommending to them. So journalists are now in Somalia one of the 6 priority categories that are prioritized in Somalia for vaccination.
Thank you. Let me turn to you, Boyana. What's been the impact of the COVID pandemic on journalists and journalism in Montenegro?
Hi. Hello, everyone from Montenegro. The journalists in Montenegro have the same problems as anywhere in the world, but with a slight difference, we haven't had the worst outcomes in terms of deaths of journalists, luckily for us. But there was a lot of our colleagues that were infected and that were sick during the pandemic because they worked, as everyone in the health industry, in the health sector, they worked during the whole time. When the whole country was in the lockdown, the journalists were working, and this pandemic showed once again that journalists don't have the same influence. They have the big influence, but a small reputation in the country, and that's something that is going on from year to year. The most consequences on the journalism were in Montenegro because journalists were devoted themselves entirely to monitor press conferences, to inform the public, to raise awareness about the vaccines and their importance. And they have almost completely forgot to be investigative journalists or analytical journalists. And even in a situation where it was obvious that the public had the right to know. For example, in Montenegro, there was one fund that was established by the government, and the public and companies had the right to invest in that fund, and then the government spent the money to improve the healthcare in Montenegro during the pandemic. And we don't know how that money was spent because no one asked during the pandemic, and journalists were the one against COVID, and they didn't do their primary job to be journalists. But that is something that is not surprising when you have in mind that they are working in conditions that have poor contracts, delays of payment, tax. For example, during the 2020, we had 16 attacks on journalists, pressures, attacks, and some physical attacks. And during 2019, we had only 3. And that's something that is a very big problem for us, because the attacks and the threats are moving to the online sphere, because journalists now don't have only to be afraid when they come to the field and do their job. They can be attacked, threatened only in their social media accounts, on their emails, and that's also a big problem during the pandemic. We had a small research during October and November last year, and with the support of the International Federation of Journalists, and we researched how the corona was impacted on working in digital media. And 86 of the respondents said that they had that the corona negatively impacted on their work. Most of them said that they had more job to do during the pandemic, that their private lives were affected. Also, the country was, the government had the possibility, give the possibility to the employees to work from home, or to, if they have small kids, then they have paid work even if they don't work during these days. And that was a huge problem in the newsrooms, because there was a small number of people who are working, and others who are working from the newsrooms. They had so many work, and they didn't cope with that. They didn't have to. They had to work all the more than 8 hours a day, and they didn't weren't paid for that overtime work. When it comes to our job protecting journalists, we try to influence both the government and the private employers. At the very beginning, we set instructions to the media and journalists on how to act and prevent the spread of the pandemic. We disseminated some of the materials prepared from the other organizations, and we appealed to employees to provide protective equipment to journalists, because that was also the big problem at the beginning. And then the state decided to help media to combat the consequences with the pandemic, and they directly or indirectly, government gave 1.5 million euros to media, and that's a very huge number of money. But the journalists and other media workers didn't receive any money from that. So we asked from the government to give some procedures so the media can have them in how they have. They didn't have a way to spend that money, and they give it to the private employees. So we appealed for that money to be distributed to the employees, and they didn't do that. And all these activities took place in 2020. We are now planning to have some campaigns, collective agreements, and importance of teleworking, and some new events that are giving place in the 2021. And we are hoping that the employers and the government would cooperate with us on that.
Okay, thank you for that. And I mean, you mentioned there about the kind of precarious working conditions that affect all of this. Omar, if I can go back to you, and you can put your hat on as a steering committee member of the Federation of African Journalists. And this is one of the things that FAJ found when it did its survey and its research, was that the precarious conditions that journalists are working in make the situation worse, make people more susceptible to having to work dangerously during the pandemic. Omar, you're muted.
Yeah, well, thanks. Well, across the continent, when you see it, the problem is the same. When you have, workers, media workers or journalists who are being denied the conducive environment that they should work, providing a duty of care by the employers and giving them the necessary protections. And then we kept on seeing the redundancy of workers, media workers or journalists that is happening. So it has become like the breakdown of the main core issues that maintain the labor relationship, especially, for example, the social dialogue, the collective bargaining agreement have been disregarded, and they're not being given consideration because of the context where they say, "Oh, we have a financial crisis. There is the pandemic, and because of this, we cannot honor our collective agreements, so we cannot implement them." That's the employer is saying that.
But even on a very basic level, a journalist who is fearful of losing their job is unlikely to refuse an assignment that could be considered dangerous because they need to earn money to live.
Absolutely. And the other place, which was quite interesting, is that journalists have been put between rock and hard place, where they have to earn living for their families, even if it is a reduced working hours, or their salaries were cut, or they were being told, to go to a dangerous assignment without BPEs. In a number of African countries, journalists are not regarded as frontline workers or essential workers.
And one of the things that the African unions have done very well is to purchase and distribute protective equipment, like your colleagues in Kenya, for example, did.
Yes. So what we did is that, yes, we were buying BPEs to do in terms of the protection of the journalists when they are going in the field, but also what we have done, and some of our unionists have taken on to address the precarious conditions to protect the journalists, whereby employers are forced for the duty of care. Like the case in Kenya, again, our union in Kenya has forced the employer to do the necessary what they are obliged, which is to protect the journalists. And that is KUJ taking a big media house, a media conglomerate, to court, and the court has forced them. Now, in this kind of a situation, the union is playing an active role in terms of being consulted, being active in the social dialogue, engaging what to do and how to protect it. But today we're having this important discussion is exactly when it is the International Labour Day. This COVID has exactly exacerbated the working conditions of journalists in Africa. And this has caused us a lot of problems. And this is why we, as journalist unionists, the IFJ, FAJ, and all our comrades in Latin America, in Europe, in Asia, we need to find a way. How do we make sure that under no circumstances the already precarious working conditions are not made worse because of COVID? And that is why the information we are getting from our unionists across the continent, from North Africa to Southern Africa, to West Africa, to Central Africa, is that the conditions are getting worse, and our colleagues some of them are dying. We only hear them when they have died, like our comrade Stanis Nkundie, Foster Dogozi, because it's like we don't know even we are sick, but because we have to do the survival, because sometimes union leaders are out to protect their colleagues who are either correspondents or reporters and protecting them. The oppression, in addition, is there. Journalists are being killed by bullets. Like my country in Somalia, one day before, a journalist was killed in Kampala. And another journalist was killed in Kenya. So the killings of journalists is going on. That enemy is still pursuing journalists, and COVID is pursuing us on this other side.
Thank you both, and I would love to talk much more to both of you about the situation, but we are very much up against time, so thanks for giving us a flavour of what is happening in your countries. And in fact, in the chat, one of the points has also been made that kind of follows on from what Omar just said from Gilbert Sendugwa. There's in some countries downsizing as a result of COVID-19 targeted journalists who were perceived to be independent or opposed to government ideas. And we've certainly seen that in a whole number of countries around the world, that those who have lost their jobs very often, it has been an attempt to silence critical voices. And that's something we need to be very aware of. So thank you to you both for your contributions. Whilst we would all prefer to be able to be meeting in person in Namibia, the one positive of an online event like this is that we can hear from a wider range of speakers from more countries. So we now want to share two brief video messages from our colleagues in Yemen and El Salvador.
بمناسبة اليوم العالمي لحرية الصحافة، يتمنى الصحفيون اليمنيون لكل صحفيي العالم السلامة والحرية، خصوصا في ظل جائحة كورونا التي انعكست سلبيا على السلامة العامة وعلى الحركة والتنقل. وتتقدم نقابة الصحفيين والصحفيون في اليمن بجزيل الشكر ووافر الامتنان لكل المنظمات المعنية بحرية الرأي والتعبير التي تساند الصحفيين والصحافة في اليمن، وعلى رأسهم الاتحاد الدولي للصحفيين واتحاد الصحفيين العرب وهيئات الأمم المتحدة، وعلى وجه الخصوص منظمة اليونسكو والمفوضية العامة لحقوق الإنسان ومكتب المبعوث الأممي في اليمن. وكما تدركون أن الحرب أثرت بشكل كبير على الإعلام في اليمن، فهنالك 40 شهيدا قتلوا وهم يغطون الأحداث في اليمن، إضافة إلى 1400 انتهاك طالت الحريات الإعلامية. ولا يزال هناك في العاصمة اليمنية في صنعاء 10 صحفيين معتقلين لدى جماعة الحوثي في ظل ظروف اعتقال قاسية وإجراءات تعسفية تخالف القانون اليمني والقانون والمواثيق الدولية. وكنا نتمنى أن نسجل لكم هذا التصوير من أمام السجن الذي يقبع فيه الزملاء الصحفيين أو من أحد الشوارع القريبة، ولكن كما تعرفون القبضة الأمنية القوية لدى جماعة الحوثي هنا في صنعاء التي تتعامل مع الصحافة كجريمة وتمنع التصوير في الأماكن العامة وتمنع العمل الصحفي بشكل كبير. نجدد شكرنا لكم ونتمنى أو نجدد دعوتنا لكم لمواصلة الدعم لمؤازرة الصحفيين اليمنيين، وحتى يتم الإفراج عن جميع الصحفيين المعتقلين، وأيضا حتى تنتهي هذه القبضة القمعية على الإعلام. شكرا جزيلا.
And one of the issues that Yemeni colleagues highlight is the number of journalists jailed. And of course, journalists in jail are even more susceptible to contracting COVID. And we've seen the situation with at least one jailed journalist who has died as a result of contracting COVID. So we echo the call from the Yemeni Journalist Syndicate, not only for journalists in Yemen to be released from prison, but all journalists who are jailed for their journalism around the world to be released from prison as well. The second video we're going to see is from El Salvador. Wait, can we take the video back to the beginning? Thank you.
Estamos acá desde la redacción del diario Latino en El Salvador. Mi nombre es Janet Estrada y la verdad queremos expresar nuestro agradecimiento al apoyo que tuvimos durante los momentos de pandemia. Nuestro periódico es un periódico muy pequeño que cubre temas de interés humano, historias de violencia sexual, violaciones a derechos humanos, y todo esto pues conllevó a problemas de tipo económico, los cuales complicaron la pauta publicitaria y el tipo de financiamiento para que sigamos trabajando. A pesar de todo eso, hemos continuado adelante haciendo nuestro trabajo. Luego vino la pandemia y fueron 8 meses de cuarentena domiciliaria obligatoria, lo que nos obligó a estar en nuestras casas. Con el tiempo también y la difícil situación económica que ya tenía este periódico, pues nuestro jefe tuvo que tomar la decisión de cesar contratos, y esto pues nos trajo problemas a nivel económico a toda la planta, que en ese momento era como 8 periodistas que tratábamos de cubrir los temas, porque las violaciones a derechos humanos seguían pasando. Pero pues puedo decir que la ayuda de APES y de ustedes llegó en el momento justo. Ellos nos llevaron alimento, ellos nos dieron equipo de bioseguridad, que también era difícil de conseguir en esos momentos, y de esa forma pudimos seguir adelante. Dejamos de trabajar a nivel impreso porque se paró la rotativa debido a los costos, pero seguimos a manera digital con temas informando no solo en el país sino en el mundo lo que estaba sucediendo. La verdad que su aporte fue muy importante, porque yo también soy sobreviviente de Guillain-Barré y no había forma en ese momento de salir de mi casa o de obtener la medicina, porque también pues todo estaba enfocado al COVID-19. Por eso, desde acá, les queremos agradecer por su apoyo, porque llegó en el momento justo, porque también nuestro compromiso hizo que, a pesar de todas estas dificultades, siguiéramos trabajando, siguiéramos haciendo eso que nos gusta, que es el periodismo. Yo les quiero agradecer y con todo el corazón, muchas gracias.
And thank you to our colleagues from the Journalists Association of El Salvador for that contribution and the work that they have done to support journalists to be able to continue to do that vitally important journalism that Jeanette there was talking about. Let me turn now to Beth and Ishtam. So Beth Costa from Brazil worked as a journalist on international news in Brazilian TV networks for more than 30 years. She's General Secretary of FENAJ, the Brazilian Federation of Journalists, and was formerly the General Secretary of the IFJ, the first woman to hold that position ever. So welcome, Beth. And Ishtam ul-Haq from Pakistan has 35 years of experience in journalism and been a senior reporter in print and electronic media, and is the information secretary of the Pakistan Federal Union of Journalists. Beth, let me turn to you first. Brazil has been the worst affected country in terms of deaths of journalists in the whole world. So give us a sense of how the pandemic has affected journalists and journalism in Brazil. And also, while you do, tell us a little about the really interesting initiative you have to plant a woods as a memorial to those journalists who've died.
Good morning, everyone. It's very good to be in this panel in the International Working Day, where we know that trade union movement is the main movement in the whole world to fight for democracy and the rights of workers. So it's very important that we meet today. Well, Brazil, as you know, I don't want to do what international news are reporting. We have the worst situation today I think in the whole world, because of our government with his denial. It's denying science, it's denying pandemic, it's denying that we need to protect lives instead of economy. So they are harassing regional governments, they are imposing lockdowns and restrictions. We have a government that is some, it's called the genocide government in the whole world. So in Brazil, we have today 400,000 dead. People died from pandemic. It's too much. And among them, 203 journalists. Yesterday, we closed our monitoring of journalists because we are a federation coordinating the work of 31 trade union of journalists all around the globe. So as we are a continental country, because we go from north with very different conditions, working conditions, living, cultural conditions. So we have 2003 journalists. It was an increase of 265% from last year to this year. So in the 3 months, in January, February and March and April, the first month of 2021, more journalists died than the whole year of 2020. And why? Because, of course, journalists was included, we were included in the essential workers, but we are not being protected as such. I envy Omar when he says that many countries, we are fighting now to put journalists in the priority group for vaccines. And you know the drama of vaccines in Brazil, because as we were denied, the government were denying all last year, all the time, that there was a pandemic, that was a crisis, a sanitary crisis. So we didn't go for vaccines. So the vaccination in Brazil today covers only not less than 20% of the population in Brazil. So it's nothing. So journalists, since the beginning, as they are denouncing the situation on the top of those sanitary and social and worsening of the condition, journalists are also being attacked by the government. As you know, FENAGE launched every year a report on violence against journalists and media houses also. From the government that are now menacing us as with court lawsuits in court. There was an increase of these journalists putting in court because of their work, denouncing the situation in Brazil. So the impact of COVID in journalism in Brazil is the same as in other countries. And we thank very much for ILO and IFJ to inspire us in many actions. For instance, we were one of the countries taking part of the first global survey that IFJ did last year. And after that, we are doing surveys, local and national surveys to realize what impact is. And we did a very good survey on gender, on women journalists, not only the impact of pandemic in women journalists, but also journalists as mothers. And we found out what's happening all around the globe, that journalists are working at home, children are out of school, and then on the top of all the work they must do as professional, it comes the third and fourth working fronts that women journalists face. Some of them, their partners lost their jobs, so they are the only one keeping money coming into the household. And they were demanding, we saw that there were pressure on their work at home, increasing of stress conditions of work for women at home, because 25% of the whole journalists in the world were put in working on the streets, and more than 70% are working at home. of course, was one of our victories, because on the guidelines we distributed to media houses, that is to put journalists working at home, most of the risky ones, the oldest, so the journalists with some former disease as diabetes and heart pressure. So we did a very strong work to have them working at home. But of course, the government made, even against labor law, they imposed some measures that allowed employers to low down working hours and salaries at the point of 25%. Yeah. So this was an impact, a very hard impact on salaries of journalists all around the globe.
Let me just bring it. Sorry, let me just bring in Ishtam here, because I know that's been a big issue for you in Pakistan as well. Journalists losing their jobs, having their salaries cut, but the PFUJ has been successful in some of the regions of Pakistan in securing support for journalists and journalism. Tell us a little bit about that. You're mute. Can you unmute? Yeah.
Oh, yes, I think. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for inviting me. On behalf of Pakistan journalists, I condole the families of the journalists who lost their lives in the pandemic, and it was as bad as the rest of the world. Pakistani journalists were badly affected by the corona pandemic. Firstly, they lost their jobs, because when you visited last year, the situation was not good as since this current government of Imran Khan is in reign for 2.5 years. But pandemic added the problems for the journalists in Pakistan. In pandemic, almost 5,000 media workers lost their jobs, because the media houses, when they have reduced their financial incomes, automatically there were a number of bureaus were closed in different cities, and most of the media houses have centralized their working from big cities, and the bureaus in smaller cities are closed. So consequently, more than 5,000 workers lost their jobs. And as Beth was talking, that the journalists were asked in earlier months to work from home. It continued for a couple of months, but later when the number of workers in media houses were reduced because there were terminations after this pandemic, so the office could not afford lesser people in the office, because you always need people to run the work in the offices. So everyone has to turn them back to the offices, and we lost one of our PFUJ vice president for this pandemic. About 40 journalists who are declared they lost their lives with pandemic. There may be more than that, but 40 are declared. It was last year only 10 journalists lost their lives, but in these 3 to 4 months it is more. Number of deaths increasing now, and PFUJ, yes, we have negotiation with the government of Pakistan because we are a federation, so we have 4 provinces to deal with. So in Punjab, we had arrangement with the government of the Punjab that each journalist who contracted the pandemic that was given 1 lakh Pak rupees as a support fund, and that who lost his life, the family was paid 1 million Pak rupees for that. But and in Sindh there was an arrangement and there was an agreement with the Sindh government. They announced to support, but I'm afraid that that was not, the promise was not fulfilled. And but PFJ on its own resources had agreements with different NGOs and provided protective equipment to the journalists. About 10,000 kits were distributed among the journalists, working journalists. And later on, because this pandemic was very new in the world and no one knew how to deal with it, it was IFJ's guidance, and later on we developed some protocols for journalists and distributed among them to work safely. But still, journalist has to be among the front runners in the field. So they had contracted this disease, and are in a great number who are still in hospital. But now the situation is a bit changed because there was no medicine earlier. Now vaccination has started in Pakistan, because Pakistan is importing 100% vaccination for this pandemic, and there were categories firstly announced by the government of Pakistan. The journalists were not among them, but we have negotiated with the government and have managed to provide now vaccination to the journalists as well. Last week we had an agreement for 3,000 journalists to be vaccinated on priority. So the things.
Yeah, and that's a really positive development that you've been able to do that. I'm really sorry about the time here. I want to give 60 seconds to Beth to explain about the memorial that you're creating to journalists as well. Thank you.
Just to close this trade union thing, we succeed through our surveys to put some mechanism on to protect jobs and to make moratorium on job cuts and a safe and health condition through bargaining from unions. So we are putting all those things on, and every union, when they are bargaining, they are imposing to owners. After the first impact, that it was very cruel, we are recovering now through bargaining from all unions. So this memorial thing, it was a very moving initiative, because we have here in Rio de Janeiro a protected area on Atlantic forest, and there was an idea of building a memorial forest. That is to say, we started planting trees that are trees to recover a very big area where there were cattle. We are building a forest, and the trees with the names of journalists that died by COVID. So the families took part. Some family, it was very moving, because there will be a forest in memory of journalists, Brazilian journalists who died in Brazil. A tree that is going to grow with a plate with the name of each one, and the families. From time to time, we will receive photographs of the growing of the trees and the memory of their own or the fathers or husbands or son will be there, I think, forever. So
and I mean that in many ways what you're saying encapsulates what this whole meeting and what we do is about. We do remember and we pay tribute to the memory of all those journalists who've died, but equally through the bargaining and everything else that you're doing, you're fighting for the fair working conditions and safe working conditions for journalists today. So thank you to both of you for your contributions there. And as I said before, we could talk for a long time, but we're very pressed for time. So before our final panelists, we want to share two more short videos from Palestine and from Peru.
Definitivamente el hecho de la pandemia ha generado una serie de dificultades en el ejercicio de la profesión, más aún en los periodistas, cuando tenemos un trabajo y un contacto directo con la población, las autoridades, y por ello en esta pandemia se ha generado una serie de ayudas a los periodistas. La Asociación Nacional de Periodistas Fidel Chimbote ha buscado los medios de poder ayudarles tal vez en ayuda con una canasta básica, también la entrega de algunos kits de medicamentos, de limpieza, de protección, sobre todo porque, como saben, muchos de los periodistas son independientes, trabajan muchas veces con espacios alquilados y eso hace que ellos mismos sean los que busquen sus trabajos, ¿no? Y es por ello que alquilan algún espacio en algún medio de comunicación. Y con esta pandemia se cerró todo. Y definitivamente el hecho de poder ayudar y gestionar nos ha dado la fuerza y la fortaleza de poder ayudar a nuestros socios. Es por ello que se ha dado lo que es kit de limpieza, se ha dado también un canasta básica de alimentos y para protección también se le ha hecho llegar a los socios de la ANP Chimbote. Por ello que, si bien es cierto, se ha hecho un trabajo articulado, lo que se busca es la protección de los hombres y mujeres que realizan la actividad de la prensa.
Thank you for that important words, but very jerky video. Sorry about the quality of the video there. Let's move across to Palestine.
منذ وصول جائحة كورونا إلى فلسطين قررت نقابة الصحفيين أن توفر لباسا واقيا لحماية الصحفيين من وباء كورونا لكي لا يكون ضحايا من هذا الوباء في صفوف الصحفيين. ألزمت كل المؤسسات العاملة في فلسطين العربية والأجنبية أن توفر هذا اللباس لصحفيين، وألزمت الإعلام الرسمي الحكومي الفلسطيني أيضا أن يوفر ذلك للصحفيين، والنقابة أخذت على عاتقها أن توفر اللباس لمؤسسات القطاع الخاص الفلسطيني والصحفيين العاملين فريلانس، ووفرنا في هذا السياق أكثر من 1000 لباس واقي كنقابة صحفيين في الضفة الغربية وفي القدس العاصمة وفي قطاع غزة.
And thank you to our colleagues from Palestine and Peru for putting together those videos showing the excellent work that they've done. And thank you to all of those panelists and those who recorded video for the inspirational work that your unions and associations have done to support journalists and journalism in your countries. Let me quickly turn to our final contributor, Victor Hugo Rico is a human rights lawyer and senior specialist at the Bureau of Workers' Activities of the International Labour Organization and coordinates their international labour standards team. Victor, welcome. And one of the things that many of us who are workers' representatives hear people saying is, but there's nothing I can do about this situation or that situation. Of course, as trade unionists, we know that that's never true. And in particular, when it comes to the right to a healthy and safe working environment. Explain to us the key international standards which enshrine those rights for journalists. Take yourself off mute, can you?
Sorry for that. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for the opportunity to share some ideas with you. First of all, I would like to give, on behalf of my director, Maria Elena Andre, her gratitude for sharing these spaces in a very special day, Workers' Day, where we are remembering the dead and fighting for the living, as you said. And it's important to remind that the UN family as such has different agencies, and the particular two added value that the ILO can contribute to this family is that we are a specialized agency that adopts and sets standards, international labor standards on the world of work. And the second added value is that we do it in a way of tripartism, the tripartite nature of the International Labor Organization, surrounded by the social dialogue. It's also an added value that brings to this family. And in this regard, you're talking about international labor standards. And it is very important to know that during the pandemic, international labor standards have been able to provide guidance, not only to protect workers, but to also try to safeguard decent work. And in this case, I would like to say that as a general principle, international labor standards protect all workers. This is the general principle, unless the specific standard talks about different categories of workers. But in general, if nothing it said, it protects all workers, and that includes, of course, journalists, freelance, and self-employed professional, etc. And in this regard, we have international labor standards, different standards on occupational safety and health. I would like to address the most important ones in the sense of the coverage and the provision of some important information about obligations and responsibilities. But in general, we have sectorial standards and general standards on OSH. I would like to make reference only of three conventions: Convention 155 on occupational safety and health, Convention 161 on occupational health services convention, and Convention 187 on the general promotional framework for occupational safety and health. Convention 155, it's an interesting convention because not only promotes the adoption of a coherent national OSH policy that will be promoting OSH at the national level, but also at the enterprise level, but clearly sets basic rights and responsibilities for employers and workers. And with regard to employers, the convention says that the responsibility is to ensure that workplaces, machinery and equipment and processes are without risk to health for the workers. They should provide the personal protective equipment free of charge for the workers, and they have to deal with emergencies. And of course, they need to ensure that workers and trade unions, the representatives, are being consulted, informed, and trained on occupational safety and health. On the other side, workers do have rights and responsibilities with regard to receive that information and training on OSH, remove themselves from any situation which they have reasonable justification to believe that presents a serious and imminent danger to their life or health. That is a right without having any retaliation of negative consequences, to be consulted and cooperate with employers on the field of OSH, but also follow the instructions received in the trainings, use correctly the devices and the personal protective equipment, and report any hazardous situation or accident that occurs. With regard to Convention 161, that here the convention talks about occupational health services. And it's very interesting that there is one part on what is the critical role of these services with regards to health crisis. And in this case, the convention also provides some wording helping employers and workers on how to take adequate measures in the workplace. So the services that the government should provide, it's on that line, and support OSH management in healthcare facilities. The most recent convention on OSH is Convention 187, that is the promotional framework on occupational safety and health, and promotes an OSH culture. And that means to have a national policy and frameworks. But having said that, and I know we have very, very short time, I would like to call your attention that the protection for workers, and including, of course, journalists, should be comprehensive and holistic. And not only with OSH conventions we can protect those workers, we can protect with fundamental principles and rights at work and other technical international labor standards that provide concrete support. And I want to make reference, finally, to the 2020 UNESCO report on safety of journalists and the danger of impunity, talking about how many deaths in this biennium 2018 and 19 happened, with 156 killings. And the majority in countries that are not are conflict armed, there's no war. So, having acknowledged that report and the last report of the UN Special Rapporteur on the violence against women of 2020, and concretely violence against women journalists, I would like to say that one of the conclusions of that report promotes the ratification of the newly adopted Convention on Violence and Harassment of the ILO. You know, in the centenary year, the ILO adopted Convention 190 on violence and harassment in the world of work, and it provides protection not only at the workplace, but in the world of work. That means outside the workplace. And you see journalists are often outside the workplace because most of them have also the duty to cover stories and news outside. So what I would like to say is that promoting these standards to be also ratified will provide trade unions with resources and tools to enforce a much stronger protection for workers. And a final word about this, I would like to say that in the centenary year of the ILO, you know, we are the oldest organization in the UN, and in 2019 we became a centenary organization. There was a clear reference of what are the political understanding of how we are going to work as ILO in the next centenary. And that is the declaration, the Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work, that has an axe on the human-centered approach, the protection of the workers, the human worker. And in that declaration and its resolution, there is a concrete recognition that occupational safety and health, clearly we're speaking about safe and healthy working conditions, are essential and fundamental to decent work. And currently, the ILO is discussing how to frame as fundamental principles and rights at work. And you know, this category is very important because it has different consequences with regard to reporting, enforcement, vocation to universal ratification, etc. And we are in the process of discussing. So it's so important to understand the holistic protection comes from different angles. And to finalize, I would like to invite you to go and look for the ILO website. There's a lot of report information, guidance on OSH, on how to protect from COVID, how to prevent, how to ensure and support benefits and income support measures, etc. But in particular, if you go to ACTRA's website, which is the Bureau for Workers' Activities, you will find a report that is called Global Trend Analysis on the Role of Trade Unions in Time of COVID-19. And that we compiled 133 countries' experiences, as Beth was talking about different surveys, on what have been the different actions trade union did, either in a tripartite manner, in a bipartite manner, or in bilateral relationships with the government, in order to influence positive policy making to respond, but also to prepare for the recovery after the pandemic. With that, you will have a lot of information that will help you reply and make a domino effect and support perhaps your fight at the national level. Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Excellent, Beth, and thank you very much for that, Victor. And yes, there is lots of information on the ILO and the Bureau of Workers' Activity website, and we will we're happy to make that available via the IFJ website as well. And in particular, go to the IFJ website and see the campaigning that we're doing on behalf of journalists to ensure that Convention 190 on violence and harassment in the world of work is ratified. We fought very hard to make sure that the workplace wasn't narrowly defined and was much more widely defined so that journalists were covered. So thank you to all the panelists for their contributions, and thank you to all of you for joining us. We hope that in the short time we've had today, we've paid our tribute to all those journalists who've died of COVID-19. And that we've also shown that strong action by journalist unions and associations has helped save lives and protect journalism, and that we do not have to accept unhealthy or unsafe workplaces or working environments. We remember the dead and we fight for the living. And if any of you need advice, support, information about any of the issues raised here today, you can contact us at the ifj at ifj.org. Stay active, stay safe, and thank you to everyone.